right. Hello, folks. Good morning to people in Western Canada. Good afternoon in Central and Eastern Canada. Thanks for joining us. Obviously, today we're here to talk about the federal budget that came out a couple of days ago and to talk about sort of the three levels of things, what it means for industry. And then we're also really pleased to be joined today by our friends at M&P, who will also talk about the corporate tax and personal tax side of things. Nicole Storshaw, our Director of Government Relations, will be helping kick us off as we talk about the political context. And then also, as I said, we're really pleased to have Kevin Wong here, partner in regional leader for Taxation Services at M&P, and Heather Weber, partner indirect tax at M&P. So thank you both for joining us. And in terms of what we'll cover, as I was starting to say, we will go through the political context just to set the stage a little bit. We've always done this in this form of sort of what it means for you, what it means for your business, and what it means for the industry at large. And we'll be really starting off with what it means for residential construction in the industry at large, talking about what came through with the budget, what didn't, and where we go from here. And then we'll pass it over to M&P to talk about the, as I said, the corporate and personal tax side of things, and then we'll wind up with some Q&A. We are, of course, recording today's webinar, and so if anybody wants to watch again afterwards or pass it on to colleagues, it'll be on our website by tomorrow. We typically take Q&A as we go with everything we want to cover today. I think we're going to probably just, you can start asking your questions as we go, but we'll probably get to those more towards the end to make sure we cover all the content, because there's quite a bit to cover. And as usual, of course, we have everybody muted for better sound quality. So if you do have questions, then just please use the Q&A function. So I think that pretty much covers all the logistics. And with that, I think we should get going because we have lots to cover. So I will pass it over to Nicole, who can set the stage for us from a political context. Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. It's actually been a while since CHBA has held a budget webinar because it's been a year and a half since we've seen one. So there's a lot to cover. And as Kevin said, I'm going to set the stage from the political context, because as much as the budget is a fiscal or an economic document, it is also very much a political document. So top line numbers, some of these you probably already have seen with the headlines in the news for the last couple of days. We're looking at over 141 billion in new spending over the next 5 years. That's going to reflect in the deficit for the 2025-26 fiscal year at over $78 billion. Federal debt is going to be reflected at 1.27 trillion. That brings us, as a country, the debt to GDP ratio is 42.4%, with a 1.25% growth forecast for next year. Now, some other top line numbers from the government is they're not just spending, they're also going to be cutting. And that includes some of the public service positions. About 40,000 have been targeted to be eliminated over the next 3 years. And they are also reducing the number of student visas. This is something they had started prior to the budget, but they've given us a number as to how much they intend to issue, and that is 155,000 in 2026, which is down from 306,000. So next slide, please. So this is, of course, the first budget from Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was just elected earlier this year. The last budget, as I had alluded to, was a year and a half ago in April 2024. We did have a fall economic update last November, so almost a year to the day. And that's actually when everything went pear-shaped politically for the Trudeau government, because his finance minister at the time, Chrystia Freeland, hours before she was supposed to table it, refused. And that's when they had to delay the tabling of the budget and have to name a new finance minister. And ultimately that led to Justin Trudeau stepping down and us having an election with a new leader and now a new prime minister. So it all kind of just kicked off last year. Mark Carney has positioned this budget as an austerity budget. There was a lot of announcements prior to the tabling of the budget, either from him or his ministers, trying to remind Canadians not to expect too much out of the budget, that there's going to have to be some sacrifices, and that was his word that he used. Under Justin Trudeau, they like to spend a little bit on many special interest groups. You don't see that as much this time. They, however, also have very little for the average Canadian's everyday cost of living concerns. That could potentially be a huge problem for them politically, because this is something that Canadians are, it's uppermost in their mind and they're very concerned about. So if they're not seeing a lot for them in this budget, that could turn around and impact favorability ratings for the current government. However, in this budget, they did prioritize what they were referring to as generational investments over cutting the deficit. So a lot of big ticket item spending, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But one of the reasons why they decided to go this route is because Canada is trying to move itself away from its reliance on the US economically and from a security standpoint. So that's why a lot of the money and spending went towards those big ticket items, which I will talk about in the next slide, please, Kevin. So this is some of the major spending we're going to see over the next little bit, including 81 billion for defense and security. This was something that was not much of a surprise, because ever since Donald Trump was elected and was talking about 51st state, et cetera, that we have been trying to increase our security, not just because Donald Trump has demanded it, but because we can no longer rely on the United States as, necessarily a security ally at all times. So a lot of this is trying to bolster our participation in NATO, for example. There's going to be 51 billion over 10 years to revitalize local infrastructure. We will go into more sort of specifics about that a little bit later. And 110 billion to drive productivity through regional economic development initiatives. Some of the details in the budget currently are still very vague, but we'll provide as much detail as we can in the areas that we have information about. And what is going to be happening next with the budget in the House of Commons is a vote is expected on November 17th. And a budget vote is deemed to be what's called confidence, or a matter of confidence. So that means if the budget vote does not pass, the government falls. And so there's potential for an election. Now, something that sort of got lost in the shuffle of budget day was a Conservative MP crossed the floor to the Liberals that very day. People were paying attention to the budget and may not have caught this, but the Liberals prior to this were only three seats ahead of the combined the other votes for the opposition parties, but now they've got one more Conservative MP to sit with them. And there are some rumors, whether or not they're true, I don't know, about whether there will be other floor crossings, because if they can get two more MPs, then they effectively have a majority government. So if we have, the next couple of weeks, we'll see sort of what happens. I think that the budget will pass, and hopefully will not be into another election. So that is the very quick view on what's happening politically, and I'll turn it over to you, Kevin, to talk about the housing policies and the budget.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Nicole. Okay, so well, as Nicole was alluding to, our last budget a year and a half ago was honestly really quite something from a housing and affordability perspective. The first two chapters were completely dedicated to housing affordability, 53 pages worth. It was coupled with Canada's housing plan that was launched, and was the first time that the Liberal government had really come forward with a major document. They had previously put forward Canada's national housing strategy, which was really a national social housing strategy, which is fine, but really missed market rate housing. And so the Canada Housing Plan put out by Minister Fraser was a very good document. We had spent a lot of time in informing that document, and it was really a series of major wins for us and for the industry. And following that, some things started to get put in place, but then, of course, the government fell, and there were some decent commitments in the Carney platform. Other things we were dubious about, but in terms of those things, particularly from last year, those are all still in place, and that was one of the things we wanted to make sure happened. But the current government is definitely losing momentum, and has, we would suggest, really lost momentum with the current budget, and we'll get into that. Certainly, the budget showed a complete underestimation of the downturn in the industry, especially when it comes to home ownership. And so it's really lacking new policies around home ownership. And they're also, very concerning to us what we consider to be a purposeful conflation between housing affordability and housing and affordable housing. And so, and this extends to, the thing they're really trying to focus on the most, and have been since since the platform, which is Build Canada Homes, and they're really overemphasizing what it really can do, especially when you look at what its funding is, and that is what's come out with the budget. And so, we released our media release, and we were really, not favorable. It's not a good budget for this industry. It's not a good budget for home ownership, which this government really needs to be more concerned about than apparently they are. And despite the fact that they've got a lot of words in the budget that suggest it's going to help the average Canadian, there's really not much in there. In terms of Build Canada Homes, it really is, and in the actual documentation and the words about Build Canada Homes itself, it's really focused on non-market housing. It is about government-supported housing on federal lands. And it will not address market rate housing, and certainly not market rate housing for ownership, and not even for rent, because anything on those public lands will have strings attached. And so that's really not going to help market rate housing, despite the fact that they say, we're going to double housing starts, and Build Canada Homes will be a big part of that. It's going to be a tiny part of that. And just to put it in perspective, the numbers, the initial tranche for BCH, they've said, they've released lands that'll do 4,000 units, which will take years. But nonetheless, even if you did that all in 1 year, it's less than 1% of the supposed about 500,000 units that the government says we need every year. And we're happy to see that that's the target, 500,000 homes. We know we're light years away from getting there, but to put BCH in context, it's less than 1%. And then, they've estimated that in total, they could do another 45,000. So 49,000 units over the course of however many years, let's call it a decade. But even if it's less, whatever, it's less than 1% of the 5 million homes that we need to get over the coming decade. So that would be fine in and of itself, because it really just is about social housing, let's call, for simplicity's sake, except for they keep saying it's going to be this big thing that's going to transform the housing, the home building industry, and it's really not. It's going to do some things. They've got some focus on factory built and modular, which is fine, but really is going to help overall. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a housing continuum, which those of us in the industry are very familiar with, and it talks about how Build Canada Homes is not going to really be focused on homelessness on emergency shelter. But you'll note that it does suggest that it's going to go all the way to the end of the housing continuum. Yet, again, those of us familiar with the housing continuum know that the end of the housing continuum isn't market-led rental with limited affordability requirements. In other words, stipulations even on rental. And at the very end of that housing continuum should be, but what has been left out is market rate housing for ownership. And so it's not included in the budget continuum. And, facetiously, I'll ask, is it included in this government's continuum at all? Because they are really doing a lot to say they're helping, but actually not doing much at all at this stage. So obviously, top of the list is the GST rebate, or really exemption, for units under $1 million, and on a declining basis up to 1.5 million. It wasn't expanded to all buyers, as we've been emphasizing is needed since this came out and was announced, and also hugely problematic. It's still not in place from a legislative perspective. So we've spent a lot of time since this was first announced explaining to the government why it needed to be expanded, how it should be expanded to all buyers, as well as to and the rebate does cover substantial renovations, but should also go to cover accessory dwelling units, secondary suites that are creating new supply, which the GST rebate and this exemption wouldn't at this stage. It should be extended to accessibility renovations. It should be extended to net zero renos. But anyway, none of that has happened. They currently estimate, though, that it's going to help as many as 15 to 20,000 buyers across the country, which may or may not be a stretch. We shall see. But it really does need to be extended to all buyers and everything else I just explained. But equally problematic, at least in the short term, has been that Bill C4, which was the legislation to get it in place, has still not made it through the full parliamentary process to get royal assent, which simply means Canadians can't access this. And I don't need to tell our builders and developers how this has affected the industry over the summer, as a lot of first-time home buyers who would have been buying didn't buy because they weren't sure whether or not they were going to get that rebate. Now, everybody who signed the sales agreement since May 27th will be able to get that exemption and get their money back, but it's still a huge problem. So we continue to push on that. And maybe, Nicole, I know you've been following the passage of Bill C4, which is what needs to happen in order for this to be in place. Maybe you can just comment on where we're at in the process right now.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. So the bill has already gone through Finance Committee, which is a committee that was tasked with studying it. They have come back with some amendments, not so much on the GST portion, because this bill includes the GST, but also includes some other affordability issues and also the cut to the carbon tax. So it's more of an omnibus bill. So while it's gone through Finance Committee and now it's headed back to Parliament for third reading, it reached there this week. They didn't quite get to it. And now that the budget has been tabled, that debate will take precedence. So we don't yet have a date as to when they will be returning to this. But once they do, it'll have to pass the House and then go through the same procedure in the Senate before it receives royal assent.
So they're still dilly-dallying. Actually, both parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, by filibustering, are just causing more delay right now on getting this through.
Yeah, I was trying to be diplomatic, but that's basically it. They're all messing around with it. So
yeah, not good. So we continue to do all we can to try and apply pressure there to move that forward. Development charge is obviously a huge issue for all of our members, especially in larger urban centers where they've grown out of control. There was a commitment through the platform to reduce DCs by 50% by working with the provinces to basically subsidize those. That wording was not in the budget. What was instead there was a new Build Communities Strong Fund, and that will be a provincial territorial stream, $17 billion, although $5 billion of that is more for the medical side of things and health. So it's really about 12 billion, but it is to fund and support housing enabling infrastructure. So that is a good thing. Any new money for housing enabling infrastructure is good. They say that to access those funds, the provinces are going to have to cost match the federal funding and commit to reducing DCs with their municipalities and not find new taxes that hinder housing supply. So that's okay, but we'll see, is that a walk back from the 50% or not? We did get a chance to talk to officials, and they're trying apparently to be more targeted, so that where DCs are the worst, those come down the most, and other places where DCs aren't quite as bad, maybe they don't have to come down that same amount. But either way, there's no details, there's no targets yet, there's no timelines. So it's really important that this get done as quickly as possible. So we will continue to apply pressure there. One good thing, although I suppose not surprising from the government's emphasis away from home ownership, but on rental, is that there was an increase to the Canada Mortgage Bond Insurance Program, and increasing that envelope from 60 billion to 80 billion, which basically increases the capacity of CMHC to support mortgage and construction loans. So that'll support the expansion of the apartment construction loan program, which has only used about half of its commitment already, its allocation, but was bumping up against annual limits. So this will be a good thing for purpose-built rental moving forward. They tried to do things for labor, but completely don't understand how residential construction works in most parts of the country, despite the fact that we've met, Nicole and I have met with two ministers just over the past few weeks, even, but it's been an ongoing dialogue about how residential construction is different from ICI. They have gone ahead with a $97 million commitment for recognizing foreign credentials, but this has to be for internationally trained professionals with a post-secondary degree in regulated professions. So going to have limited, it might have a little bit of help for residential construction, but really quite limited. And they've also talked about 75 million for training, but again, delivered through unions, and that's fine. You know, unions can make use of this, and we do have some unionized workers, but most of our workforce in Canada in residential construction is not unionized. And so the stat is that outside of Quebec, only about 10% of our workers in residential construction are unionized, which includes the GTA, which is mostly unionized for residential construction. So again, a miss on labor. They are trying to create some tax advantages for people to invest more in productivity. They've labeled their collection of tax deductions as a productivity super deduction. This will, in fact, help investments in machinery and equipment and technology. It can help, especially our members on the factory built side. It is in line with recommendations that we've made in terms of tax breaks for investment for factory built through our sector transition strategy. But the only way we can get a lot more investment by our factory built people within the association, as we've continued to express, is by actually fixing the whole housing supply system, because it's hard for factories to invest when we're not getting enough sales. So a lot more to be followed up on that front. We had successfully fought the underused housing tax when it came into place a couple of years ago. It was really an ill-informed tax approach in the first place. We were successful in getting industry exempt from this tax. This budget is now saying it's going to eliminate it completely, so that is a small good thing. Fortunately, we had already gotten our industry extrapolated from that. So not a good budget, not a good budget, and then we will continue to be very expressive about that, and I've already started through all of our media follow-up and interviews over the past few days. I didn't want to be completely depressing in all this, so I do want to remind people that we do have some good things still in place. So we do have the 30-year AMS, which was the big win late last year for all new construction and for all first-time buyers for uninsured mortgages. We continue our regular meetings with the Bank of Canada. They're very concerned with going on with housing. In fact, they're in their next round as they look at what to do with the way they do their monetary policy reporting and take decisions on interest rate cuts. They're going to look at housing differently because rising interest rates also drive up the cost of housing and shelter, which then contributes to inflation, which they're trying to reduce by increasing interest rates. So we're engaged in all those discussions. Thank you to all of you who complete our housing market index, which they're very interested in, and meet with us before every rate announcement. And we back to the key point, reductions have been coming with interest rates, so that has been a positive. The fact that the government's still talking about doubling housing starts is a good thing. A few years ago, there was no talk about the need for more housing writ large, so that is a good thing, despite the fact that they might not be taking the best approach to it right now. These things are still on the table, haven't been taken off, which is reviewing the stress test and facilitating longer term mortgages. Those are good things. There was the increase in mortgage insurance and price limits to up to $2 million for refinancing a home, and that would enable you to build secondary suites. So that's a good thing. The home accessibility tax credit is still there, so a positive step for renovation. We do still have housing outcomes tied to the infrastructure and transit funding that's already available, so that's been good. There is a government focus on skilled workers. They're just not getting it right, but we're in active discussions with that, and hopefully we can continue to educate them. And there have been quite a few actions to support factory built housing, again, supported by our sector transition strategy. So we've had some things. We were coming off a couple of years of really good things. But obviously, right now, there's a ton that needs to be done and to get this government better focused. And so we'll be engaged on with lots of recommendations in a variety of ways. GST is top of the list. We will continue, and we're actually going to have a new campaign moving forward. But there's lots that's been going on this. We've had over 72 million impressions over the past few months on this. We had a dedicated campaign to MPs. We had over like practically 12,000 views just targeted at MPs and their staff just to try and get movement on this. And so we will continue that momentum. We have a fact sheet that's been available that some of our locals and EOs and members have been using to really press on what we need in terms of GST and in terms of expansion and getting Bill C4 done. Moving forward in terms of next steps, as Nicole was alluding to, the government's missing the mark by not addressing home ownership. It is still housing affordability and accessibility are still a top concern, even in this Abacus poll from the beginning of October, ahead of concerns over Trump. And affordability is also a big part of the rising cost of living too. So the government needs to take action, and we will be emphasizing that. In terms of home ownership, again, results from the Abacus poll, there's still an expectation from Canadians that they want to be able to buy a home and should be able to. And while 65% is the overall number, what we really need to look at is at younger Canadians who are still in that category and a huge part of the voting base. So when you talk about young Canadians 29 and under, 86% of them want to own a house or a home one day of some sort. And age 30 to 44, where maybe a little bit more reality is setting in, still 75% expect that they want to buy a home of some sort one day. And this budget is not helping them in any way. One of the challenges, and we often get asked, why doesn't the government understand this? And it's a mix, we think, of where they want to emphasize, but also a complete misunderstanding. Because if you look at the top line numbers in terms of housing starts, they actually look okay for Canada. And these are some of the numbers that just came out of CMHC, where housing starts for all areas of Canada were up 14% in September. And actual starts in our larger urban centers year over year are up 19%. So on the surface, that can look okay. So, which is where some of our struggle is. But what we're explaining is housing starts have completely shifted to rental. And that's why so many of our members are feeling this so hard. And the number to remember in that we're putting forward here, and we also break it down at a municipal level in that, but starts for ownership have dropped since 2021 from 70%. So in 2021, units destined for ownership were 70% of the units being built, and it's now down to only 50%. So that is a really significant drop. It's a change in the marketplace, and it really helps to explain why, well, it's good that we're building more purpose-built rental. It's not good that that's coming at the cost of home ownership. We should be building a lot more of both. And this is really what shows up in our housing market index. And again, we use this to communicate regularly with the government and with the Bank of Canada. We've been successful with the Bank of Canada and obviously have a ways to go with this current government itself. But look at that single family number for Ontario out of 100, down at 7.1 compared to 93.9 in 2021. So it's really a disaster in terms of home ownership, and multi-unit is no better nationally. And again, Ontario at a ridiculous 4.4, but it just shows how everything is completely dried up. We're also the HMI numbers, and again, thanks for those of you who are filling it out. It's so helpful. Talks about how concerned our members are. So basically, 91% have some form of concern, from somewhat concerned to all the way to extremely concerned. And again, 41% of our members have been laying off on a permanent basis, and that number jumps to 64% in Ontario. So obviously, things need to be done. So where do we go from here? Well, we're launching a post-budget campaign, very much focused on home ownership and the GST. That is going to be supported by some public opinion research that we were going to be engaging in now. We were waiting for the budget to come out, to see the wording, to see what was going to be done. When we were at the Build Canada home opening, the Prime Minister had said there were going to be things in the budget to support market rate home ownership, and in fact there weren't. So we will continue to work on that, and we're really going to bring lots of attention not only to MPs, but really we know the way to government is through Canadians and through voters. And so our public opinion research, as well as what we put out in the media, is going to be very focused on bringing reality to what's actually going on. Obviously, we'll continue with our extensive engagement, both at the public service level and at the political level, to try and regain the momentum that we had previously to support market rate housing. And we will also be supporting, engagement of any locals and members. Like we've got the GST fact sheet, for example, that's being used. We know there's extreme concern, and I just talked about what's going on in Ontario. We are working with OHBA and with Build GTA to support even more action that will benefit Ontario, but all of the country, ultimately on things like extending the GST. And we do this on a full-time basis all the time anyway, but our day on the Hill coming up in early February is going to position us well, because the next time for big announcements, probably financially, and that will really come in the spring economic update. We used to have a spring budget and a fall economic update. This government has decided now they're going to do fall budgets and spring economic updates. So we will be well positioned to take that on. So lots of work to do. I wish I had better things to say about the current budget, but here we are, and we'll keep going. As I said, we'll take questions at the end on all of this, but I do want to make sure we have time for our friends from M&P. So with that, I think, Kevin, you're going to be doing most of the lead here, but over to the two of you to get us going on the personal and corporate tax side of things from the budget.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, just to thank the CHBA for providing us with the opportunity to partner with them in this webinar. As Nicole had mentioned, next slide. As Nicole had mentioned, on Tuesday, Canada's finance minister had delivered the 2025 budget that anticipates a $78.3 billion deficit. Leading up to the budget, there was considerable anticipation in the tax community leading up to the budget, as expectations were that it would include many new tax measures. And as it turns out, the budget contains relatively few new tax measures, mostly of a technical nature. And rather, what it does do is really expand or extend many previously announced tax measures. Anytime a budget comes out, the common question from family and friends is whether or not there were any changes to personal or corporate tax rates. In this budget, there were no direct changes to personal or corporate tax rates. What I'm going to do for the next 15 or 20 minutes is just review select tax measures at a high level that are included in the budget. And as Kevin had mentioned, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of it. Next slide, please. Starting with business tax measures, the very first one. Immediate expensing for manufacturing and processing buildings. So this is probably the most impactful tax measure from a government revenue perspective. When a business purchases a depreciable capital property, it's eligible to deduct the cost of the property over time. Depreciable properties, what happens is that they're grouped into classes depending on the nature of the property, and each class would have its own rate of deduction. Presently, the current rate of deduction, or CCA, capital cost allowance, as it's known, for buildings where 90% or more of the floor space is used to manufacture or process goods for sale, provides a CCA rate of 10%. And what the budget does is propose a temporary increase to the CCA rate for these buildings to 100%. So in other words, a business can claim 100% deduction or immediate expense in its first tax year, provided all the conditions are met. And these conditions are mainly at least 90% of the floor space is used for manufacturing or processing. The business or the taxpayer or any non-arm's length party didn't previously own the building, and the building hasn't been transferred to the business on a tax-deferred basis. Next slide, please. This measure would be effective for eligible buildings that are acquired on or after budget day, and they're first used for manufacturing or processing before 2030. After in 2030 and through 2033, the CCA rates begins to scale down. So it goes down to 75% for years 2030 and 2031, and then down to 55% for 2032 and 2033, then reverts back to the 10%, as I had mentioned, the current rate after 2033. One thing to note whenever we take depreciation, especially with the immediate depreciation, is a concept of recapture. And what happens is in the future, when the business either sells the building or there's a change in use of the building. So it's originally acquired for business use, and then perhaps its use is changed to a personal use. What happens is recapture can arise, and effectively what it is that the amount of deduction for depreciation that was taken in previous years gets included into income. So in that particular case, what effectively happens is it's effectively a deferral of tax. Next slide, please. One of the other business tax measures is tax deferral through tiered corporate structures. Budget 2025 announced changes to the refundable tax system. And refundable tax was originally introduced many, many years ago to prevent individuals from deferring tax on investment income being interest, rental income, capital gains, through the use of a corporation. And what happens is that when a corporation earns investment income, it's initially subject to a high rate of tax, generally about 50%, depending on which province you're in. So that's both a federal and a provincial component. And this 50% rate comprises two components, a refundable portion, which is about 30%, and then a non-refundable component of about 20%. So when a corporation pays a dividend to its shareholder, what happens is that the corporation is going to receive a refund of that refundable component, and the shareholder, if the shareholder is an individual, is going to pay personal tax. If you add the tax of the corporation and the individual, it should equal the tax that the individual would have otherwise paid had they not earned that investment income through a corporation. And where you have tiered corporations, so say a parent corporation, a subsidiary corporation, what's intended to occur is that when the subsidiary corporation pays a dividend up to the parent corporation, the subsidiary corporation is going to receive a refund. Let's call it $30. And what happens is that the parent corporation is going to pay tax an amount equal to that refund that the subsidiary corporation had paid. And if both corporations have the same year end, the subsidiary corporation is going to receive a refund in year one. The parent corporation is going to pay tax in year one. There are planning strategies using staggered year ends that achieve a short-term deferral. So, for example, subsidiary corporation could have a year end of December 31st and the parent corporation a year end of December 30th. And what would happen in this particular case, the subsidiary corporation pays a dividend, gets a refund of that refundable portion in year one, and the parent corporation wouldn't have to pay the tax until year two. So what the budget does is propose amendments to target these certain planning strategies to prevent that short-term deferral. And how it achieves that is that to the extent there is a deferral of that refundable tax, the proposals would suspend the refund to the company until such time that a dividend is paid up through the chain and the individual pays personal tax on that. Next slide, please. Next slide. So scientific research and experimental development, or SHRED as it's known. The SHRED program is intended to encourage businesses to carry on research and development that will lead to new, improved, or technologically advanced products, processes, devices, or materials. And in my view, Canada has one of the more, if not the most generous R&D programs amongst developed countries. Just looking at the statistics for the most recent year, Canada had provided $4.5 billion of investment tax credits to over 22,000 claimants during the most recent tax year. There are two rates generally, that federal rates that apply to SR&ED. There's a 15% federal non-refundable for non-Canadian controlled private corporations, or that would apply to say public corporations. And then there's a 35% refundable tax credit that applies for Canadian controlled private corporations. Back in November, there was a fall update, and that fall update made a number of announced measures in respect of SR&ED. Prior to that fall economic update, the expenditure limit for SR&ED was $3 million. The fall update had increased that limit to $4.5 million. The expenditure limit is basically the base on which the investment tax credit is calculated. It increased the taxable capital phase-out threshold for determining the SR&ED expenditure limit from 10 to 50 million to 15 to 75 million. And what that is that when a corporation's taxable capital begins to exceed $15 million, its expenditure limit begins to become scaled down and completely phased out at $75 million. It extended the eligibility for the enhanced investment tax credit rate of 35% to what they describe as eligible Canadian public corporations, which is basically a corporation that's listed on a Canadian stock exchange that isn't controlled by a non-resident, and also restored eligibility for capital expenditures. So once upon a time, a long time ago, capital expenditures, which is basically expenditures for equipment that's solely used for SR&ED activity, businesses were entitled to a deduction for that capital expenditure, but also eligible for an investment tax credit in respect of that spend. So fall economic update had announced the restoration of eligibility for capital expenditures. Next slide, please. What budget 2025 does is propose to increase the expenditure limit to $6 million from the previously announced $4.5 million. So fully realized at the federal level, that would equal about $2.1 million of federal investment tax credit on $6 million of eligible expenditures. Next slide, please. There were a number, one of the other proposals, a lot of businesses who undertake SR&ED rely on refunds for funding purposes, and one of the things that the budget proposes to do is to speed up the time for claim processing. Plans to implement a pre-claim process for upfront technical review. So there'll be a process where the CRA, you can engage with the CRA to determine the eligibility of a project. Also proposes to cut processing time in half down to 90 days from currently the 180 days. Next slide, please. There were a number of clean energy and investment tax incentives, critical mineral exploration tax credit, which is part of a flow-through share program, which is intended to encourage Canadian exploration for certain minerals. And what the budget proposes to do is expand the eligibility of minerals to include bismuth, cesium, chromium, tin, and tungsten, which are minerals that are vital for modern technology, clean energy, and defense applications. The clean technology manufacturing investment tax credit, it's a refundable tax credit equal to 30% of the cost of investments in new machinery that's used to manufacture or process clean technologies. And what the budget proposes to do is expand the list of critical minerals eligible for this tax credit to include antimony, indium, gallium, amongst others. Next slide, please. Investment tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. CCUS is a refundable tax credit for eligible expenditures relating to CCUS, and it provides three different full tax credit rates ranging from 37.5% to 60%, depending on the purpose of the equipment, and applies for years 2022 through 2030. And what the budget proposes to do is extend the availability of this full tax credit rate by 5 years, so it should run right through 2035. Then there's the clean electricity investment tax credit. It's a refundable tax credit of 15% on the capital cost of eligible investments in equipment relating to low emitting electricity generation. And what the budget does is propose to include the Canada Growth Fund as an eligible entity for investment and eligibility for the tax credit. The Canada Growth Fund was formed by the government in 2022 with a mandate for making investments in Canada's clean economy. Next slide, please. The carbon rebate is a form of government assistance, and generally government assistance is required to be included back in income. And what the budget did was confirm previous announcements that these carbon rebates are going to be tax-free. Next slide, please. Going on to personal tax measures. The trust 21-year rule. Trusts are used very commonly in planning, and especially with shareholding structures for businesses. And associated with trusts is what's described as a 21-year rule. And the 21-year rule is intended to prevent trusts from being used to indefinitely postpone tax on accrued gains. And what happens is that on the 21st anniversary of a trust creation, it's deemed to dispose of its property at fair market value, thereby triggering a gain and tax. One of the options available to avoid this 21-year deemed disposition rule is the trust is able to distribute the property that it owns out to its beneficiaries on a tax-deferred basis. There is a certain express anti-avoidance rule that prevents an old trust from distributing property to a new trust that's a beneficiary and effectively refreshing another set of 21-year rules. There have been certain avoidance techniques utilized to indirectly transfer property from an old trust to a new trust and avoid the 21-year rule and effectively access another set of 21-year rules. And what the budget does is, and what this planning did was really seek to do indirectly what can't be done directly. So what the budget 2025 proposes is to broaden the current anti-avoidance rule to include indirect transfers of trust property. Next slide, please. Personal workers support tax credit is a new 5% refundable tax credit up to an $1,100 per year maximum for eligible personal support workers who work for eligible healthcare establishments. So the credit would be fully realized at $22,000 of eligible wages. Eligible support workers are generally defined as healthcare workers who provide one-on-one care or support to patients and otherwise help patients with activities of daily living and mobilization. They need to be employed by eligible healthcare establishments, which are generally hospitals or nursing care homes. One interesting of note is that BC, Newfoundland, or Labrador are not eligible for this tax credit, given these jurisdictions have bilateral funding agreements with the federal government that increase personal support worker wages in these provinces. Next slide, please.
Kevin, I'll just note that you got quite a few slides still to go, but we're running a little short on time. So if you could wrap up in the next 5 minutes to make sure we have time for Q&A, that would be good.
Sure. Okay, why don't we, next slide, please. Canada Canadian Entrepreneurs Incentive. This back in 2024, when the government announced the increase in capital gain inclusion rates, this is a companion proposal that came in to basically propose reducing capital gain rates to half, or to the extent that individuals had sold shares of certain qualified small businesses, and they're no longer proceeding with that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Automated filing of individual returns. So a lot of means tested benefits, such as GST investment tax credit or input GST refunds, or Canada Dental plan rely on filing a tax return. And what this does is really give the CRA discretion to basically automatically file returns for individuals to ensure that these individuals receive the benefits. Next slide, please. Next slide, just in the interest of time. Next. Proposal to amend luxury tax items to exclude luxury tax on aircraft and vessels. Next slide, please. Kevin, you had mentioned the proposal to eliminate underused housing tax starting for 2025, and also Bear Trust. So Bear Trust is simply generally an arrangement where one person holds legal title of a property on behalf of another that's a beneficial owner. I mean, common Bear Trust arrangements include like a parent holding a bank account for a child, or in real estate where a nominee corporation holds title of real estate. Previously, prior to 2023, Bear Trusts weren't required to file a trust tax return or make any sort of disclosures. And then in 2022, legislation was introduced to cause Bear Trust to have to file returns. The government had subsequently, for 2023, beginning in the 2023 year, and in 2024, the government had come out and said, well, we're going to defer the application of this to 2024. Subsequently, they deferred it again to 2025, and the budget proposes to defer the requirement for Bear Trusts to 2026. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and hopefully they're just kicking the can down the road and will ultimately eliminate that, because, yeah, we did a bunch of work on this, so fingers crossed.
And this one, in response to industry concerns that individuals or drivers in the trucking industry were misclassifying themselves as independent contractors rather than employees, thereby allowing employees to circumvent tax obligations. The budget's providing funding to the Canada Revenue Agency to improve tax compliance, namely focusing on driver classification, whether they're independent contractor or an employee. The companion proposal with this is reporting fees for service. And what that is that's a legislative requirement for businesses to report fees paid to other businesses for services provided. Payments that exceed $500 have to be reported to the Canada Revenue Agency in prescribed form, which is on what's called a T4A. So for the past 15 years or more, there's been a moratorium on the requirement to report fees for service on the T4A. So what the proposal does is lift this moratorium in the trucking industry and to basically implement a focused program that addresses the trucking industry. So, next, please. Next. And previously announced measures. These are a number of previously announced measures that the government or the budget had announced that they intend to go through with. As you can see there are quite a number of outstanding measures that need to get through. And with that, as I mentioned up front, not a lot of new tax measures. They really don't alter, in my view, the status quo for CHBA members. As a result of their in respect of their planning. Proposed measures have a lot of implications both for the manufacturing and construction industries, as I mentioned, with the immediate expensing for manufacturing buildings. There are continued enhancements to SHRED program to make it more accessible in value. And as I just recently mentioned, there's a backlog of proposed legislation that increases uncertainty for taxpayers. So.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. You landed that well. You had a lot of information there. You covered a lot of ground there. So we're gonna hop into the Q&A portion. We've got a few here, and maybe this one maybe is for you, Kevin, or Heather, or both. And it was just sort of a simple question around what's in the budget for small and medium-sized businesses to help them scale and grow.
Yeah, I think the two major measures are to the extent they apply, or the opportunity for immediate expensing of buildings or additions to buildings that are used for manufacturing and processing. To the given a corporate tax rate of say 27%, just say, if a company invests in a building that's used for manufacturing or processing of say $10 million, I just use that for illustrative purposes, that provides $2.7 million of immediate tax savings. The other one would be the shred. As I had mentioned previously, it really is one of the more generous programs, and it's to the extent you think you may have be eligible with process or anything that you're doing, it might be worthwhile just engaging with an individual who's a shred subject matter expert to see whether or not there is eligibility, because the program really is generous.
Perfect, thanks.
Other than that, sorry, I guess I had mentioned the status quo. I mean, my recommendation would really be continue, with the status quo planning. There's a lot of planning, even not relying on, even given that there aren't a lot of measures in the budget, sort of back to basic planning. So certainly engage with your tax advisor. Perfect.
All right, our next one is around immigration, and there was some mention around immigration levels and that in the budget. I'll maybe pass this one over to Nicole. Nicole, the question is there any indication about cutbacks on the overall immigration, not just student visas?
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you to whoever asked the question. Indeed, there has been more attention and more media focus on the cutback of the non-permanent residents of mostly student visas. That has been the focus of the government to bring that under control. But when it comes to permanent residents, they are holding pretty stable. Prior to the budget, the number was supposed to be 395,000 per year, and they have announced that it's going to be 380,000 per year for the next 3 years. So there will not be any substantive change into the number of permanent residents that they will be accepting.
Perfect, thanks. We also had a question about how much of the 13 billion that had been announced for BCH and was reiterated, and so that's Build Canada Homes, was reiterated in the budget. And I mean, the one thing to understand is when they announce numbers like that, they're allocated over multiple years. So how much has been spent so far? The answer is very little, and that's because it really just got launched. And that $13 billion is spent or spread out between this year all the way up to 2030. So the allocation for this year is actually less than $1 billion, and then it ramps up to over $3 billion for the next 3 years, and then $2 billion in the final years. So very little. They're just getting started, and the intent is really, obviously, most of that money needs to roll out when major construction is underway, which won't be until next year and the years that follow. Do you have anything to add on that, Nicole?
No, just sort of what you said is absolutely correct. That the government communications makes it sound like it is going to be right now, and that's not always the case. It is very much spread out. So nothing has sort of really started on that other than the announcement of what they intend to spend.
Yeah, exactly. Then there was a question here about with respect to, I was saying there's really nothing in the budget to support market rate housing. Wouldn't the increase to CMHC's the ACLP and the mortgage bond stuff be for market rate housing? Yes, it would. It would, and then we do say that is a positive. When I say there's nothing, there's practically nothing, and especially around home building. So home ownership. And so if you consider that the GST announcement for first-time buyers was one that was already made, there's nothing new. And the DC thing is, we'll see what happens with the development tax side of things. That was also announced previously. It's been adjusted a little bit. No details, but again, nothing new. So in terms of anything new to support market rate and home ownership, yeah, there's little to nothing, unfortunately. But that Canada mortgage bond increase from 60 billion to 80 billion is a good thing for market rate rental, at least. So when we talk about let's see, what do we got here? Oh yeah, so here's one. Can CHBA, along with advocating for GST rebate for all new homes, also express how the net zero mandate adds unnecessary costs to new homes? Oh my goodness, yes, we do that on a continual basis. Along with the GST advocating, there's all kinds of other things we're asking for. This is just a snippet of the many things that need to be done. But certainly the impact of adding more things to the building code and how expensive it is moving to net zero or otherwise is something we are continually engaged in. And it's not even just going all the way to net zero. Some of the next steps to go to even the next tiers, and there are 5 of them in the code, can be very expensive if not done properly. So that is something we are engaged in on a very, very regular basis. Another question probably for you, Kevin. I mean, we could touch base on it, but you're the tax expert. So the question here is: so if we build a new factory for prefabricated housing, can the building and the equipment be written off within 1 year? And what if we lease the building or the equipment? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way the legislation or the proposals written, and this is of note, usually whenever there are 2 tax measures, there's draft legislation that accompanies it. With this particular provision, there, for whatever reason, wasn't draft legislation, so you're gonna have to rely on the announcement that the government made. To the extent that the building is purchased and it's used, more than 90% of the floor space is used for manufacturing or processing goods for sale, which sounds like building prefab homes would be, then you're eligible to expense 100% of that in the first year that the building is being used. With respect to a lease building, I don't believe that would qualify, but perhaps if there was a leasehold improvement or addition or cost that was incurred, it might be. But it's one of these things that the devil's in the details, and we have to wait for the draft legislation.
Perfect. Thanks. Another question here, this one for us around the HMI. So the question is, with respect to the HMI, is it fair to compare to the 2021 post-COVID crisis high, which is an anomaly? I think I'll talk about 2 stats that are very relevant there. One is the HMI numbers themselves, which were super high. They were, like 90 out of 100, which was great. And the other number, which is not an HMI number, but a reference 2021, was just the share of home ownership units for home ownership, which was up around 70% in terms of starts versus 50. And I will say, absolutely, it's more than fair. That's exactly what we need to be comparing to, because if we're going to get on track, especially for more homes to home ownership, the only way that happens is if there's enough policy change such that the industry is really rolling and industry sentiment is back up in the 90s. As long as it's negative the way it is right now, that is a definite indicator we're not going to get anywhere near really increasing housing starts, let alone doubling housing starts. So those are really, we need to get back to 90 in terms of an industry sentiment indicator, and we need to get our ownership levels way back up, because we're not going to be able to build the kind of housing numbers that we need if the average Canadian family can't use their own purchasing power and be able to invest to be able to buy their own home. So yeah, we'll definitely be sticking to needing to compare to those types of numbers. Another one here, will the infrastructure spending filter down to and be administered by the province through grant programs? And when do you expect this to start rolling out? Is there any indication of how much total is going towards Ontario? There wasn't much detail on this in the budget itself. Nicole, I don't know if you happen to have the spending profile handy at all in terms of the rollout timing for this.
I don't have the spending profile right in front of me, but I do know that they intend to funnel it through the regional economic development agencies for the federal government, more so than the provincial governments. Of course, it would be depending on the type of project, but that is, again, I think so much of what is also in the budget, it depends on more detail.
Mm-hmm. Which is often, which is typical for most budgets. And the challenge is devil is in the details on a lot of things all the time. But well, this is one we'll be tracking very carefully and frankly engaging in those. I was in the budget lockup myself with the officials from the Prime Minister's office and Department of Finance, and some of those discussions have started already, where we talked about the need to get this defined really quickly and work with us as industry to inform how that's going to happen. So a lot more to follow on that for sure. Okay, looks like we're a tiny bit over, and normally I'd say we'll stick around, but this is the last question we've gotten, at least so far. So this is the question: is CHBA getting involved in the Cowichan land claim appeal? If you're not following this out in BC, the Cowichan Nation has put forth a land claim on some land in the Lower Mainland, looking for compensation and right now they're restricting that claim and looking for compensation more for from government and business lands, or I shouldn't say business, more for government lands, not privately owned land. Nonetheless, it is a very, very significant case, and it could extend. They still say they're not going to extend it to privately owned land, but obviously could have huge ramifications. We are watching it carefully. It's going to make its way through the BC court process. The BC government is currently appealing that claim, so it'll go there. I fully expect it'll ultimately end up in the Supreme Court of Canada, at which point we probably will get engaged in what is called as an intervener, because it has significant impact on potentially the entire country and certainly our industry. If you haven't followed what we've been doing on the Supreme Court, we've had two big wins in the past couple of years on land expropriation by municipalities that were major precedent setting in favor of landowners and our industry, and especially our developers who would be landowners and would be worried about land expropriation by municipalities. So those are successful, and we would intend to do the same, I expect, if and when this makes it all the way through to the Supreme Court. Okay, I think we have covered off all of the questions, and we're a tiny bit over, but we always do want to stick around for anybody who has questions and make sure we answer them. And so with that, I will say thanks a lot to Kevin and to Heather, who was there just in case. And we really appreciate your time and effort on all of this, M&P people. And we do have follow-up contact information for if anybody has further questions. We'd be happy to pass those along. So thanks a lot, Kevin. Really appreciate that. And to everybody else, and thanks, of course, to Nicole. You do a great job all the time. We appreciate everybody sticking around and hearing all the information we can convey on the budget. And obviously, we have our work cut out for us to continue to do a bunch of work on the advocacy side to help move things forward. And as I mentioned at the start, the recording of this will, in fact, be available by tomorrow for anybody who wants to follow it again or pass it on to your colleagues at work. So thanks again. Appreciate it, and take care. We'll see you soon.